Thank you, Callie, and thank you to, well, first of all, Callie Ellis for all the work behind the scenes she did to get y'all together here. I also want to thank Dr. Andrew Torgett, who, if you were out there during the reenactment, you heard him narrating the events, and he'll be giving a lecture as well as part of this series. And more generally, I want to thank the Texas Historical Commission and the San Jacinto Commission and the the folks that keep this this building going, this museum going, and this event, this commemoration every year going. So this is an effort that takes a lot of people, and your presence here is an endorsement of that. And so I want to thank everyone for coming. I also imagine you're happy to get out of that heat. And we have this very nice auditorium here, nice and cave-like. So I hope, hope you enjoy your time here. And what I want to do is take advantage of a captive audience here to have a conversation, about the battle itself, but more generally the meaning of the battle. Why is it important? What are the ways we talk about it being important? What are the ways we don't talk about it, its importance? And I want to bring different perspectives to thinking about that significance. And I'm a historian. I teach history at the University of Houston. I've been teaching there for 23 years now. Every year, for about 20 of those 23 years, I've taught Texas history to college students. And I want to bring some of my perspective of teaching college students Texas history to our conversation today, because one of the things about teaching college is it feels a little bit like Groundhog Day. Only in as much as I keep getting older, but the students stay the same age. They're different students, mind you, but they come in at the same age nonetheless, and yet they're not the same students. From each generation, you notice that it's a different world that they grew up in. It's a different world than the world I grew up in. It's certainly a different world than that you grew up in. And we have, as historians, we kind of think about that. We think about change over time. We think about how societies change, how culture changes. And as a result, that our changing world also changes our ability or shapes our ability to see the past and understand it in our terms today. And because I think that's important. Look, if I want to look, I look out at you here today, and I see folks that are interested in the battle, who are interested in history. But I want to end this afternoon talking about who's not here and how we can increase interest in the battle, how we can increase interest in Texas history. And one way to do that is by expanding that perspective. And that's what I'm going to propose today. Now, the way I plan on bringing up this transformation is by doing a little bit of art history. I will admit I'm not an art historian. I'm just a plain historian. And one of the advantages of being a historian, you might find out, is that we like to think of ourselves as dabbling in a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And our job is to try to put it all together, to try to make sense of different kinds of information, to try to bring it together to see what story the evidence is telling us. And so what I want to focus on, and I have a little snippet there on the side, is the painting, The Battle of San Jacinto, by McCardle from 1895. Now, this painting hangs in the Senate chamber of the Texas legislature. How many of you all been to the Senate chamber? Okay, so almost half of you. I've been there. The first time I went was when I took my then seventh grader on a school field trip to Austin and involved visiting the Capitol. We went inside and I got to see that painting. And I'm going to talk about actually the two McArdle paintings at the back of the Senate chamber, because I think by looking at them together, we'll get a good sense of ways we think about and talk about Texas history, talk about the past. And I don't think it's a coincidence that these paintings are in the chamber where our laws are currently being made today. That's my point here, is that understanding the past is important and significant and relevant because it is impacting the kinds of decisions and choices we're making in the present. And it might seem disconnected, but the deeper you look, the more that you learn not just about those events in the past, but the ways that those events have been communicated and passed on from generation to generation tell us more about those generations as well. So here we have the Battle of San Jacinto. And what I want to like I said, I'm going to do a little bit of art history work, but I'm not an expert in this. But I want to talk about a concept in art history that you might have heard if you took an art class or you studied art, which is perspective. And this is literal perspective. In other words, when you make a painting that it's from a particular point of view, that you then incorporate that point of view into what you are depicting, and perspective and framing are critical to something you want to project, something that you want the viewer to receive. And so perspective is very important in this painting because this painting is seen from, I guess, almost like a bird's eye view. I'll go a little bit into what McArdle said about his intent on that perspective. But I want you just to think about where you would have to be to get this view. Honestly, it was great to see the reenactment just now because you walk out, especially if you walk out of this building, you're already on an elevated platform, probably about as elevated as this perspective, right? So you have this elevated platform and then you look out and you could see everything. The reality is, and I know there was a little bit of a hill on one side so you could get up on the hill and see things, but if you were down at ground level, it's kind of difficult to see everything happening from that perspective. So perspective is important because it gives you a sense of overview in this case. So McArdle purposefully chose that perspective when he painted the Battle of San Jacinto. He also subtitled both paintings. In this case, he subtitled the painting, the Battle of San Jacinto, Retributive Justice, the Triumph of Texas Independence. So it's kind of a funny subtitle. It's two subtitles, really, right? It's Retributive Justice and Triumph of Texas Independence. I'm going to focus on both those parts, particularly the word retributive. In other words, retribution. He's focusing on the idea that he's communicating the sense that the Battle of San Jacinto was retribution for something. Now, it's retribution for the other painting in the Senate chamber that I'll talk about in a second. But so that retribution is important to understanding how we talk about the Battle of San Jacinto. Let me take a moment here to just also kind of be transparent of the challenges I sense in talking about this subject. When I was invited to speak here, the request was, can you speak about the Mexican perspective on the Battle of San Jacinto? And certainly that's important. When you saw the reenactment and there were folks dressed as Texian soldiers and folks dressed as Mexican soldiers, I think there's a lot of interest in who the Mexican soldiers were, what brought them to this battleground, how the fact that hundreds died in this battle is significant. This site is essentially consecrated with their blood. So we recognize that. And I want to also recognize the organizers of this conference for saying, we should know these multiple perspectives. They're worthwhile. And again, your presence here means you're interested in that perspective and seeing this other perspective. And I have this moment of pressure, feeling like, okay, so what is the Mexican perspective? I need to all of a sudden represent the Mexican perspective, and it's a tough thing to do. Or what would you want to hear about the Mexican perspective? I'll tell you the Mexican perspective of the Mexicanos who are here, right? What you get a sense for is terror, right? Of fear. And by the way, and not incidentally, the fear that was felt by Tejanos, the Mexican Texans, who are on the Texian side. They were very aware that when in the middle of the pitched battle, there was a chance that they would be seen as Mexican. And you get the sense from this battle that the sentiment by the Texian army was the only good Mexican was a dead Mexican. And that's the effect of the retributive part, the retribution, the revenge, right? And fearing that retributive justice, Tejanos, who were fighting on the Texian side, who were supporting the Army of Texas, and were soldiers of the Army of Texas, had to find a way to distinguish themselves from Mexican soldiers, and they wore white paste cardboard on their hats to signal the fact that they were friendlies. Otherwise, they would die from friendly fire. This is not a byproduct, but it gives you a sense of that moment. And by the way, McArdle was aware of that when he was painting the Battle of San Jacinto. I want to point out a few things here. I'm not going to go into great detail of the painting. I'll show you a few elements. Again, this is at the moment of the Texian army overrunning the Mexican breastwork. You have here the Texian flag. You have Mexican flags. You see soldiers retreating, Mexican soldiers being shot. You see the Buffalo Bayou in the background here, where many of the soldiers run. As many soldiers died from the conflict being shot as drowned in the Buffalo Bayou. So this was, again, a scene of terror, of straight of carnage. The numbers themselves speak to that moment. Over 600 Mexican soldiers died to a handful of Texian soldiers, right? So those numbers are, almost 1 to 100, right? So that's a gross imbalance, right? So there's something, in many ways, I think that reality of the battle makes the moral of the battle more important. And that's where these two parts, I think, that this idea of understanding the retribution part is important for understanding how Texians thought of that battle. So let me turn back to McArdle for a second here, and note that McArdle was attempting to make an accurate recreation of this moment, of this battle. One of the nice things that we have is we have all of his notes, the amount of research he did to paint this painting. Let me be clear here. McArdle was not at the Battle of San Jacinto, and he was not at the Battle of the Alamo, right? He wasn't there. These paintings are drawn or painted, 60 years, almost 60 years after the battle took place. So he's counting on these documents. There are few survivors of the Battle of San Jacinto. We know for sure there were no survivors of the Battle of the Alamo. That's significant. So he's going for accuracy. And in fact, one of the documents in that collection, and they're all available at the Texas State Library and Archives website. And we have, for instance, the map that McArdle used to base his painting. We would, I think, say that this painting then is attempting to be a literal retelling of the Battle of San Jacinto, short of getting in your car and coming here on Saturday afternoon and spending your afternoon watching a recreation. That painting is all we have until films come around, right? We have this is essentially storytelling through art, storytelling through a painting. And so as a result, we're looking at this painting thinking, what is the story we're getting? And the story, as I see it, what we're getting here is we're getting a kind of schematic. I mean, it literally is a map made into reality when you look at that painting. Let me say you look at McArdle's own words in his own description of that painting. At the moment he's going into what's being represented here, he says, the period of action represented when the Mexican right is flying in wild confusion before Sherman's and the left of Burleson's command, when Cos is in rapid retreat and Santa Anna is in mad flight for the bridge, when Lamar, Deaf Smith, and Carnes and others strike like a tornado the left of the Mexican center, still barely holding to the breastwork, led by the heroic Castrillon, when General Céspedes is mortally wounded and Luelmo lies dead, when Almonte, Trevino, Aguirre, and other gallant Mexicans are making their last stand and hopeless rally, and when the weird and lengthening shadows from the declining sun add to the dramatic effect of the death grapple. Is that what y'all see when you see this? Again, maybe this is communicating drama. I mean, certainly, I'm glad I came early and got to see the reenactment, because we're reenacting things as a way to have a sense of the order of when things happen and what took place and who was there. But that's just all information. That's just all data. Seeing people actually going through those motions allows you to put yourself in their place. It's a way of capturing that fear, capturing that anger, capturing that danger, certainly capturing that sound. I mean, how loud were those cannons? I knew, at every moment I knew when they were going to fire, and I still jumped in my shoes when that happened. So that gives you a deeper understanding that you don't get from reading a book. In fact, McArdle mentions that himself. Says this is an attempt to go beyond what you can say in a book. So when he then gets into what his goals are, he lists them 1, 2, 3. And his first goal is very direct. First, truth, period. Second, the dramatic, with most intense and graphic power, yet softened by poetic fervor, period. Third, not a slavish transcript of the model, though the strongest realism is preserved, was deemed sufficient. It has been sought to render vision, intensity of personal, national, and race attitude, gesture, and expression, nor is it in the multitude of figures so studied and brought out that the greatest interest may be found, but rather in the wealth of episodes, where the grouping, movement, action, and expression represent and continue in rapid succession. He's trying to capture the energy of the moment, right? You could focus on one little corner and tell a whole story. He's trying to put all the story on this painting. And by the way, again, for those of you who've seen this painting, it's about this large, right? Maybe a little smaller than this, but these are massive panels in the back of the Senate chamber. Now I want to put this next to its pair. When you look back at when you're standing in the Senate chamber and you look at the back wall where you entered in, on your left is this painting, Dawn of the Alamo. On your right is the Battle of San Jacinto. I kind of think of this as the alpha and omega of the Texas Revolution, right? This is the start. This is the source of that retribution, of that sense of revenge. In fact, this painting, entitled Dawn at the Alamo, is subtitled The Moral Victory. Right? And it's dated 1905. There was an earlier version of this painting that burned down. So this is a second take at it. And in this painting, we get a different perspective. Do you see the different perspective here? This painting is not from a bird's eye view. This painting, you're in the action itself. You're at the level where this is happening. And there's some startling parts of this painting. You have, of course, I think your eye is, well, there's a couple of places your eye is immediately drawn to. Again, now I sound like an art historian. Your eye is drawn through perspective to a couple of these areas. You see, first of all, a Texian dying with the flag in his hands. He's sort of unnamed, unseen. Then you immediately turn to Travis. And I could just spend an entire lecture talking about just this one section of Travis with his gun drawn, standing on the wall and protecting and defending his fort, and most importantly, a Mexican soldier sneaking up to stab him in the back. Here we have Davy Crockett swinging old Bessie. There he is. Again, fighting to the death. You have, I think, Bowie is here somewhere. I'm not sure if that was him. In any case, you have the 1824 flag. But really, if you look at this painting, it's much darker. It's much darker. This painting is meant to create a different emotion. Well, let me just say, it's meant to create emotion. It's meant to fill you with anger, with, again, that desire for revenge that comes from the sense of moral outrage, of moral outrage. And so in that sense, those two paintings kind of need each other, right? You need to feel the outrage to understand why the Battle of San Jacinto is important, why it's, why they require each other. In fact, let me put them side by side in the way they appear in the Senate chamber. Maybe this is a little closer to what size they are. What we have here then is the two paintings side by side, and what you get is a sense of that gap. And what I want to focus then on in this comparison is what having this different perspective, what these different emotions do. What do you get from them? What do you get from them? And the way I want to describe them is that I'm going to use kind of shorthand for each of these paintings. For Dawn at the Alamo, I'm going to call that emotion. Right? That's an emotion. That's not an attempt to diagram where everyone's standing, create an accurate depiction based on every single retelling, diary, memoir, interview from survivors. First of all, because all the survivors are Mexican. And even though we do have Mexican accounts for decades, over a century, first of all, they were written in Spanish and Texans didn't read them. And when they did, they didn't trust them. So what do you trust? You trust the story that gets told. And the story is one of remember the Alamo. Remember that tragic moment. So it's attempting to communicate tragedy, not describe where someone was standing, where the cannon rolled on somebody. It doesn't fit that way. It doesn't even look like a place. I mean, it's about creating this emotion. So that's my keyword for emotion. Now I was trying to think of what's the way I would then describe the Battle of San Jacinto in comparison. And the only word I could come up with was mechanical. It's essentially a clinical analysis of the battle. It's cold and dispassionate. I mean, there's some passion. I mean, he talks about the retributive justice, but the passion is all in the other painting, and it's being transferred on. If you didn't have this other painting, you're like, what are they so worked up about, right? You wouldn't know it if they weren't next to each other. So I want to say that those two elements are important to understanding why we. Not only why we are here today on April, commemorating the events of April 21st, but I think more importantly, it's significant and important to how we think of Texas. And what I'm going to do is, here's my teacher moment here, and say, when we talk about Texas as a place and the Texas Revolution and the Battle of San Jacinto as a moment of Texas independence, we quickly go to this idea of Texas independence meaning the Republic of Texas, Texas nationalism. And so I want to pause here for a second and say, when we think of nationalism, whether it's Texas nationalism, American nationalism, Mexican nationalism, there are two parts that rely on each other, but that we often confuse for each other. Because there's nationalism, the emotional part of it, that feeling, that identity, that connection that you have with other people. That's about a sense of self, right? That's an emotion. That's an emotion that we would ascribe and what I'll call nationalism. The country part of this, right? The United States of America, as described by the Constitution, or the United States of Mexico, or the Republic of Texas, are nation states. Those are mechanical. Those are sets of rules, sets of laws, currency, economic systems, where you put the roads, what you call the roads, things like that. Those are ways of getting, maybe what I would say is ways we organize our society. But for one to succeed, we need the other, right? They are self-reliant. And what I want to argue, or what I want to present today, is I would just want to ask you for a moment to look at the Texas Revolution, look at the events at the Battle of San Jacinto, and ask, was the Battle of San Jacinto fought to make the Republic of Texas? Right? Was that the goal of the battle? And the way I would answer that question is by looking at historical documents, looking at what people are saying at that time, who they are, and how this event fits in the context of their lives. So let me turn to the second part of my talk, which is the documents part of it. So I did my art history. I'm going to put my art history hat aside. By the way, I love art history. And I love, I know there's some kids here. I have 2 teenagers. I hope I've instilled an interest in going to art museums with them, in them. Occasionally they go to the museum on their own, and I'm so happy when they do that. But it's, again, I think it's a way of appreciating how we communicate, how we pass on sentiment and feeling. And as a historian, we tend to focus on the details without trying to understand the feeling that comes along with it. And I want to be able to do both. Can we think about that feeling and talk about the mechanics? And what I want to turn to is 6 months after the Battle of San Jacinto, there's a Texas-wide vote. And there's 2 parts of that vote, and I'll give you the returns of that vote from Washington County here. There's a vote that has 2 issues. The first issue, who will be the leader of Texas? And it comes down to Sam Houston or Maribel Lamar. Who won? Sam Houston, by a landslide. Everyone loves Sam Houston. Maribel Lamar was a little bit hard to get along with, right? And everyone knew that. But on top of that, Sam Houston was the victor at the Battle of San Jacinto, was the genius, was the leader that kept everyone together. I mean, there were several moments when the whole thing could have fallen apart. And Sam Houston was able to keep everyone together. So that was part of it. I want to focus on the other question that was raised. And that was, what should we do next? Should we A, vote to annex with the United States and become a state in the United States? Or B, form the Republic of Texas? Here, I'm going to take a quick vote. I mean, I'm sort of have the answer up here, but if you don't know the answer, raise your hand if you thought the majority voted to annex and become a state in the United States after the Battle of San Jacinto. Okay. Raise your hand if you thought that the majority voted to form the Republic of Texas. Raise it high. I want to see what you thought. Okay. If you're gonna support the Republic of Texas, do it like you mean it, right? All right. You know what? 95%. 95%. You can't get 95% to say that's a nice day outside today, right? Somebody will have a complaint about something. 95% of those voting, those men who voted to annex with the United States. Period. It wasn't even close. It wasn't even like, well, maybe, I don't know. No, 5%, only 5% said, no, we should form the Republic of Texas. Who's crazy, right? This is, to say you're in the 5% means that you're kind of a fringe in the general, you're not part of the mainstream. You're not part of where the majority is going. So what happened? So this vote is taken, and they say, oh, well, all right, Sam Houston appoints someone to go to Washington, D.C. and say, hey, we voted, we want to join. And we know what happened there, right? No, what are you talking about? For a variety of reasons. I think the most clear reason is that the United States Congress and Washington, the government in Washington, D.C. was pretty split between the future of the country. Half of the legislators wanted to keep the United States, make it a free country, and the other wanted to make it a slave country. And admitting Texas was going to throw that balance off. So no, they were outright rejected. There were other reasons. I mean, it would have looked like imperialism for the United States to just take Texas right after that battle. It took another 10 years before that happened, but that was, at least at that moment, that was not a popular opinion. So they say no. So the representative comes back and says, sorry guys, I know 95% of you wanted to become a state, but we can't. So what is the Republic of Texas? Plan B. So here we are, right, talking about what was this battle fought for? Was it fought for Plan B? Again, and here I just need to point, I could just stop the lecture right here and say, that's my point, right? I could just say, seldom do we as historians get such a direct, unequivocal answer to a question like this. I mean, there's so much gray area we deal with all the time in interpretation. I don't know how else to interpret this, right? And there's other evidence I could use to continue to raise that kind of question. Let me turn to the other document. You might be more familiar. What was the document that was signed on March 2nd, 1836? The Texas Declaration of Independence. Here you have it. 60 men signed the Texas Declaration of Independence on March 2nd, 1836. Now, there's some issues I could bring up around the Declaration itself. The fact that it was in the middle of the battle that it was fought, so it's not really starting the Texas Revolution, it's sort of in the middle of the Texas Revolution. What does that mean? What does that indicate? I'm going to avoid that conversation for a moment and focus on one aspect of this. Who were the men who signed the Texas Declaration of Independence? Now, of those 60 men, only 2 were actually born in Texas. Jose Antonio Navarro and Francisco Ruiz. Their signatures are there at the top left. That's it. 58 of them were not born in Texas. I don't think they had the bumper sticker, but I got here as soon as I could, right? That comes later. But I feel like this is maybe relevant. Okay, well, let's just say that we know that, but I'm going to spend a moment to talk about the other 58. Again, I was asked to talk about the Mexican perspective on the Republic of Texas, and I think part of me would say, like, well, I'm going to spend all my time talking about Jose Antonio Navarro and Francisco Ruiz, and believe me, I love talking about them. They are the 2 of the more interesting figures in American history that you will ever come across. Francisco Ruiz, was a leader in San Antonio during the Spanish period, during the Mexican period, during the American period, as was Jose Antonio Navarro, who became a state legislator, as was Juan Seguin, who became a state legislator, right? Became a legislator in the Republic of Texas, right? These are figures who have committed their lives, who were born here, and had made families here, were important to their community in Texas. They had a lot riding on this. They had a lot riding on these events. So, again, I could talk about them, but let me talk about the other 58, because I think it's important to look at who they are. Well, the first question I had was, where were they born? If I'm going to ask the question of that Jose Antonio Navarro and Francisco Ruiz are born in San Antonio, where were the other 58 born? Well, fortunately, we have a volume, Kemp's Signers of the Texas Declaration of Independence, that was published in 1944. And when you go through those biographies, you realize, again, the vast majority, I think it's obvious, were born in the United States, so we know that. There were a few that were born in England or Scotland. I'm getting my De Zavala was born in Yucatan, right? There are a few that were born in other places. One born in Ireland, but 13 of them. Oops, I'll skip ahead here. The 13 of them were born in Virginia. So that's I'm a historian, not a mathematician, but that's about 20%. If I'm doing the math right here, about 20% of them were born in Virginia. Another 11 were born in North Carolina, and 10 were born in Tennessee. So there you have over half of them were born in 3 states: Virginia, North Carolina, or Tennessee. That's the Texas Revolution. It was exported from those states into Texas. Okay. There's other information we get, and I think that's important to note. When did they come to Texas? So where are they from? All right, they're from all over this. They're from the United States. 50% of them are from just those 3 states. By the way, pretty much 95% of them are from other southern states, right? So this is about southern immigration to Texas. This is not about American immigration, it's southern immigration, right? We have to remember that. We have to keep in mind. And that's important to understanding the role of Texas in American history. This is a critical element of that history. They were not just Americans, they were Southerners coming to Texas. Now, when did they come to Texas? Well, we know the Declaration of Independence was signed on March 2nd, 1836. Well, 29 of them, or almost half of them, came after January 1st, 1834. So they had not even been in Texas for more than 15 months. In fact, if you look, I have here, sorry the print is so small, but you could see the dates, and I guess it's down to 1835 here. So most of them, actually starting right around here, the biggest chunk of them come after January 1st, 1835. So in that year, half of them spent in Texas. In that year, half of them spent in Texas. Did their heart become Texan? That's, again, this is the connection I'm making between heart and the emotional and the mechanical, right? Did something happen where they transformed, right? It's a legitimate question, and if we're going to say yes, we need to identify where that is. But again, I'm adding 2 and 2 together. I'm adding this evidence along with the vote in September of 1836. So you have to be able to answer both, explain both of those questions. In fact, another third, or you get up to 43, so over 2/3 came after the law of April 6, 1830, which was already the point where Texans, the Anglo-Texan immigrants, realized that, hey, maybe this is not going to work out the way we think it's going to work out. So there are actually barriers to them feeling Mexican. I mean, this is Mexico, right? Is that their national identity? One more feature here, and this one this is impossible to read. It'll be better in the book. You'll be able to see this. And here's the last part of it, and I think the most important to understanding American history, but also to understanding what I'm presenting today, which is the Mexican perspective on the Texas Revolution and on the Battle of San Jacinto. And that is that the vast majority of those, and here's the list of all those who came, I think this is all those who came, the 43 that came after the law of April 6, 1830. The vast majority of them came to Texas from some other state in the South. In other words, they could have been born in Virginia, then they moved to Mississippi, and then they came to Texas. And when you look at that, the majority of them had already made one move beyond where they were born. This is a very American pattern. And what they were doing is this is how expansion happens. This is how the United States grew, by people getting up and moving. You can't, and the secret of American history is that the people usually moved before the government moved. That was the case here, and what I'm talking about. Certainly, that was the case when British Americans were living in the colonies, and they start going west, where the British government told them, "Hey, stop it! You're causing all these trouble with native peoples. The French are not happy with this, and what do you get? The French and Indian War." And the British government essentially trying to make things better, but they couldn't, because they couldn't control these British American colonists. And after a while, it was these questions of the frontier that drove the Albany Plan, that drove politics in Western Massachusetts, right? This question of those places outside of the seaboard, outside of those settled cities, that's where the conflict happened. And that's where this migration was driven by people ahead of the government. Certainly that's what was happening in the South in Cherokee and Creek lands, where even with government contracts and treaties, those were ignored by the settlers in those places, and the government essentially had to go to Plan B and say, well, we can't control these settlers. Your best option is to move. And you have resettlement into Oklahoma, and the story we know, we have, first of all, resistance to that resettlement. We have the Trail of Tears, and then we have those that did survive and continue to have that native identity still part of their identity as well. So the United States is always behind these settlers, right? And I think, and my argument is that's what's happening here in Texas as well. So what is the Mexican perspective? The Mexican perspective, when you're seeing these Americans coming to Texas from the South and continuing to establish towns and governments and local governments in the manner that they were already accustomed to in the United States. So my argument is that these Texians never stopped being American in their heart. I mean, they called themselves Americans. The Mexican government called them Americans. They formed the Republic of Texas as a mechanical aspect of nation, but they were American when they came to Mexico. And I want to put an asterisk here and say, in the same way that I'm not going to generalize about Mexicans, I'm not going to generalize about Americans. And we know, look, Stephen Austin learned Spanish, became Catholic. He was a Freemason and went to the Masonic lodges with Mexican Masons. And that was, in fact, one of the instrumental ways that they established political alliances. Right? So Austin was one of the few who sincerely would call himself a Mexican and believed that you had to follow the rules. Clearly not everybody in Texas believed that, and certainly the Mexican government didn't help their cause when they jailed him in 1834 in Mexico City. So that, but in that regard, this question of the Mexican perspective on the Texas Revolution then and the Battle of San Jacinto then appears as a form of slow and unofficial annexation. Slow and unofficial conquest. And one other bit of evidence that I would point to in that regard is that at annexation, at statehood in 1845, in President Polk's inaugural address, he refers to the annexation of Texas, and he uses this word, quote, the reunification of Texas. The reunification of Texas. Now, for a long time, I would look at that word reunification and think, what might he be talking about? Because you don't see it a lot, right? You didn't see it a lot. Initially, the way I made sense of it was, well, I suppose he's talking about the fact that some Americans in the kind of Mississippi frontier believe that Texas should have been part of the Louisiana Purchase because of the French presence for a moment, for a cup of coffee in Matagorda Bay. And they were indignant and outraged that Secretary of State Monroe Adams signed the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819, and they literally, their editorials throughout Missouri and Louisiana and Kentucky stating that Texas was given away. They gave away Texas as part of the Adams-Onis Treaty, and we need to get it back. And that was a story, right? That's a story that these immigrants told themselves when they came to Texas. And I always thought, well, maybe that's what he means by reunification. We're making whole that particular version of the story. And maybe that's the case. But I also believe that the reunification is we're bringing these Americans back. Like I said, they never stopped being American in the Mexican period. They never stopped being American during the Republic of Texas, more importantly. And they rejoined, they became whole again with annexation in 1845. So that's the slow conquest I'm talking about. People were willing to invest and wait for their investments to pay out, right? They were waiting to wait a long time. By the way, just to add to that investment, many of those who were upset that Texas was not part of the Adams-Onis Treaty made a killing when Florida was added to the Adams-Onis Treaty because they had investments in Florida, and now that was part of the United States. And those investments overnight at the signing of the treaty became doubled in value, right? So this was an economic play, right? That for many of these investors. Again, not emotional, right? That has, we could add another layer of mechanical if that's the focus we want to take. Finally, and I want to add again. In the Mexican perspective, this the annexation of Texas and later the invasion of Mexico by the American army in response to the Mexican outrage of the annexation of Texas in 1845 led to rapid expansion of the United States. And accelerated a question and concern, as I mentioned earlier, that was already existing in the United States, which is, as you expand westward, is this territory going to be open to slavery or not? Starting with the Northwest ordinances that Thomas Jefferson signed, there was the question of territories being open to slavery was closely debated and regulated as the nation grew. And you had line after line that was drawn to say, to essentially put a cap on new territories that were closed to slavery. Texas was the loophole. Texas was a way to essentially get around that artificial limit that was placed in Congress. But again, this was just passing the buck down the road, right? I'm mixing my metaphors here, but because essentially this was unsustainable, is my point, and the political and economic tensions that led to secession and the Civil War have their roots in the future, in what would be done, what would happen in these Western territories. Finally, and I wanted to highlight again this question of Mexican perspective, because Mexicanos in Mexico, and then those who were in what it was now the United States, right? So again, imagine yourself, you're Mexican, right? You're Tejano, you're Californio, you're Hispano in New Mexico. And again, from one day to the next, after the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, now you're American. Again, does your heart change overnight like that? It begs the question what it meant to be Mexican. And Mexican identity itself is a complex identity, one that's very regional even to this day. Being Mexican in Oaxaca versus being Mexican in Chihuahua are two different things, but we're all Mexican in that regard. So being fronterizo, somebody out in the frontier, in this northern frontier, was its own form of identity. And certainly, being in close proximity to native peoples, sometimes involved conflict, sometimes involved intermarriage. That was the complexity of that time. during the Civil War, Mexico was facing its own threat, which was the French intervention. And these Mexicans in the United States, in California and in Texas, recognized that that alliances were being made between the French and those supporting the French in Mexico and the Confederacy in order to circumvent the Union blockade of cotton and run Confederate cotton through Mexico to continue to fund the army and the war effort. So what did they do? They supported Juarez, and they sent funds, they sent weapons to the Mexican army to resist the French intervention. This is a whole nother story, right? I mean, the Southerners who, at the end of the Civil War, many Southerners went to Mexico and started their own communities in a town called Carlota, after Maximilian and Carlota, right? And so there are, these links were not theoretical, right? This was the way they were navigating the period. And so we're coming up to Cinco de Mayo next week, right? That commemorates the Battle of Puebla, where the Mexican army was resisting the French intervention in the city of Puebla, just south of Mexico City. And the hero of that battle was Ignacio Zaragoza, born in La Bahia, Texas, and a Tejano, who was the general who led one of the most important battles in Mexican history. So when people talk about Cinco de Mayo, I say that's a Texan holiday, right? It's a celebration that was celebrated in the Mexican community here. This is from the San Antonio Light in 1882. Beginning just years after the battle, and to this day, right? So this is one continuity in history. So they saw their support of Juarez as opposition to this essentially backward economy, this continued enslavement, right? They saw this as something we're fighting against. And again, I don't want to essentialize. There were many Confederate Tejanos as well, followers of Santos Benavides in Laredo. But there were others who were on the Union side in South Texas, followers of Juan Cortina, who were, who saw that alliance tied to the resistance to the French. Let me end then with two points. One is from this building. If you walk around the building today, you'll see that the history of the Battle of San Jacinto, and really the history of the Texas Revolution, is literally etched in stone on the side of this building. I don't know what I would do if somebody asked me to write something that was going to be etched in stone. I mean, you mean I can't edit it with my word processor? It would cause me a lot of stress. But there it is. And I think there's two ways we can look at it. We can look at it as the history the way this story was told at the moment that this building was built, right around the Depression, the American Depression. In fact, you see a lot of sort of Art Deco motifs in this building. There I am, now I'm an architectural historian. And what's amazing about it is some of the things I've been talking about are right there. When you read this panel, it says that this battle led to annexation and to the Mexican War. There's nothing there about the Republic of Texas. I mean, there's other parts that talk about the Republic, but that's the impact that I'm talking about, right? Even in 1940, they were telling you that. There's another panel that talks about the soldiers who are fighting out there, and what does it call them? It says citizens of Texas and American immigrant, it calls them immigrant soldiers. It calls them immigrants, right? That's on those panels etched in stone. We can't, we have to be able to talk about that if it's out there. And one final thing I want to say is again, I teach at the University of Houston. I'm teaching young people every day who understand their lives in a complicated way, who understand identities as being layered, sometimes contradictory, but having to make sense of a complex world every day. And we need to be able to give them complex stories about the past. Otherwise, they're going to think it's just a big fable. And that's the myth of the Texas independence that I think we need to be able to work on as we move forward with this new museum that's coming, and as we continue to talk about and celebrate the war. I think I'm out of time because we have a speaker, but maybe we'll stick around and have question and answers afterwards. Thank you.